Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this lecture series, Peace Through Dialogue, where we share perspectives, case studies, theories, applications of track 2 conflict dialogue in different contexts. My name is Oliver Fink. I'm an SNF research fellow with the Herbert Kelman Institute, guiding us through this lecture today as discussant and moderator. And today we're talking about the timely and important topic of broadening the use of interactive problem solving. Where is it applied? Where should it maybe not be applied? And it's my true pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Christopher Mitchell. Originally from the UK, born and educated in London, he has held academic positions at the University College London and the City University, becoming Professor of International Relations there. He then migrated to the US, becoming Professor of Conflict Research at the Center for Peacemaking Practice at the Carter School at George Mason University. And it's great to have him here today with us. He is one of the few people, if I'm correctly informed, who worked with John Burton and with Herbert Kelman, two of the most important pillars of interactive problem solving. And he will share a bit of his experiences in Cyprus and how the two came together, sharing his practical experiences there. And then in the second part of the lecture, he'll be talking about an example of broadening the use of interactive problem solving, specifically in the post-agreement setting of Colombia. Chris, where I did my PhD, the lab where I did my PhD, we always introduced the guest speakers asking a question. And the question was always the same, and namely, so if they wouldn't have pursued an academic career, so in your case, in the realm of peace and conflict studies, what would you have done? What would you have engaged in as an alternative?
I think probably it depends when I try to answer that question from. I mean, if I was thinking of what I was like when I was 15, I desperately wanted to be an officer in the Royal Navy, because in those days there was a Royal Navy. So I would probably have ended up as a lieutenant, a very old lieutenant commander or something like that, retired. But the Royal Navy did not want me, so I became a schoolmaster, and then I became a university teacher. A different kind of a career. So
interesting. From the Royal Navy to peace and conflict studies.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Not quite
very much
thing.
Looking forward to your talk. Over to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. As you say, I'm going to try to divide this I think it's 2 hours, into a first half and a second half. And the second half, I'll try to talk a little bit about the content of the chapter that I wrote mainly for Tamara's urging, possibly I should say her nagging, and it concerns problem solving and some of the work that we were doing in Colombia. But the first half, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to talk a little bit about Herb Kelman. Because after all, the book, and I think the lecture series is, I think it was originally intended as a festive for Herb while he was still alive. and now it's become a kind of a memorial to him. And he and I go back a very long way. And we came into the field of peace and conflict resolution at more or less the same time. So if you will indulge me, I'm going to try to go back to, oh gosh, it's almost 50 years ago now, for when Herb and I came across one another in circumstances which I think pushed him very clearly in the direction of his studies of peacemaking and problem solving in general, but ultimately, I think in the efforts, long drawn out efforts to make relations between Israelis and Palestinians rather better than they had been, and much better than they are now. And Herb came very close to improving those relations in many ways. And the story of how he actually got there, I think, is an interesting one. And you'll have to forgive me by staying with me as I go back into history and try and explain how Herb became, first of all, interested in problem-solving workshops, and then became much more involved in Israeli-Palestinian relations. So back, I guess, to the 1950s, 1960s, and I was at that time, I had just finished a first degree in international relations at London University. And at the time, London in international relations was going through what it flattered itself by calling an intellectual revolution, the behavioral revolution of the time, which totally transformed the study of international relations in very many ways. I think actually if I'd done my degree even 5 years earlier, it would have been a very different kind of a degree. I mean, basically, if you were doing international relations at the time, it was basically a branch of current affairs. You actually learned a lot about contemporary history of a particular part of the world. You learned a little bit about institutions and how they worked and how they were supposed to work, the UN, what was then the EEC, and you also learned an awful lot about the ways in which law could be used to mitigate or resolve conflicts. What you didn't actually learn about very much was useful theories that could be applied to ongoing conflicts. And that was one of the things that actually hit international relations very hard in the 1960s. It changed from being a study of contemporary history to being a study of theories of conflict and peace, in the direction of efforts to make generalizations about such things as arms races or sort of other processes that were involved in peace breaking and peacemaking. There was a kind of a search for more general theories that could be applied to ongoing conflicts and not just to individual examples of conflict. I mean, I remember one of the books that I read at the time was a book by a Quaker called Kenneth Boulding, and it was called Conflict and Defense, a General Theory. And it was an endeavor to produce some theories about conflicts that could be useful not to simply understand the conflicts that were going on at the time, but would be useful for understanding conflicts of the future. I remember one of the things that struck me very forcibly was that somebody in one of the chapters had actually managed to reduce arms races to a pair of simultaneous equations, which I thought was, took a lot of intellectual chutzpah and left off out an awful lot of things. But it was a time of people being interested in models, people being interested in data. It was an era when the collections of large data sets was just beginning, the kind of thing that people use in many of the works coming out of the University of Uppsala. David Singer, for example, was starting up on what we call the COW project, which stood for Correlates of War, and that was something which probably 10 years ago nobody would have thought of doing, except possibly Quincy Wright in Chicago. And part of all this was also an interest in taking these ideas and actually applying them to practical peacemaking. I mean, one example of this was, I'm sure students even today still read Roger Fisher and Bill Urey's book, Getting to Yes, which was intended to be a kind of a handbook to help people in the process of negotiating for peace wherever the negotiations were taking place. I mean, it was probably one of the best-selling books that I've ever come across. It certainly enabled Roger Fisher to travel the world trying to solve conflicts. It certainly gave Bill Urey the opportunity to do what he wanted. I think he would have answered Oliver's question in a very different way before and after he published that book. Anyway, so there was this side of things which sort of said, well, okay, you've got these theories, you're supposed to be an academic, what good are you? Try to produce some kind of results from this. And there were a number of people who sort of took up that challenge. I remembered particularly there was a professor called Richard Walton, who was very influential in talking about negotiations between management and workers in industrial relations. And another person who's often forgotten these days is a Yale psychologist called Leonard Doob, who I think has been unjustly forgotten in this particular endeavor to apply ideas from theory to problems. Now, I first came across this particular strand of activity because shortly after I graduated at University College London, I sort of plucked up my courage and went and asked my professor if he had any jobs. And he, much to my surprise, said that he was about to set up a center called the Center for the Analysis of Conflict at University College. And yes, it did have some jobs, not very well paid, but they were jobs. And he would appoint me as a junior lecturer. I think I was one of the first appointments to the Center for the Analysis of Conflict. My professor at the time was a guy called John Burton, and excuse me from sort of veering away from this story for a moment, but he was a most interesting professor and one of the most creative people I've ever come across. He'd been a diplomat. He was when he started out answering Oliver's question, he would have said he wanted to be a diplomat, and that's indeed what he was. He was an Australian diplomat, which gave him a different slant on the world. I always remember that if you went into his study, he had a map on the front door, but it was an upside down map. Australia was at the top, and the rest of us were at the bottom, and that was his attitude towards a lot of traditional international relations. He always said, look at the world from the bottom, and it looks different from the world at the top. He was I think the youngest head of the Australian diplomatic service that they've ever had. I mean, we're talking now about the time of the conference to set up the UN. We're talking about the period immediately after the Second World War, when the Australians said at long last that they weren't simply an attachment to London, but in fact had a country of their own with problems of their own, with things that they had to deal with from a southern viewpoint. And it must have been, I think, a very interesting time to be in Australia and to be in the very young Australian diplomatic service. Anyway, John was the head of the diplomatic service. He, among other things, attended the San Francisco conference to set up the UN. He knew virtually everybody from that era. He knew Nehru, he knew Tito, names that will be familiar to some of you anyway, but probably not others. He was actually driven out of Australian public life during what was, according to all accounts, a quite dreadful McCarthyite period in Australia, which was even worse than in this country. And he was, of course, branded a communist, which he was a communist about like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but he was, as soon as that stuck, and as soon as he started being investigated by the Australian Secret Service, it tended to mean that he was the target of all sorts of smear campaigns. So in the end, he had to leave public life. But when I first ran into him, he was my professor. This was the early 1960s. And he was, turning himself from being a professional diplomat to being a quite dynamic academic. These people, Leonard Doob, John, Richard Walton, several others, were looking, as I say, to do something practical about the many conflicts, and particularly about the Cold War, which was raging at this time. And in John's case, I think he became very interested in some work that was being done in London at the Tavistock Institute to do with studying groups, group dynamics. What happened when you got people 10, 15 together in a room for a while? Did they actually manage to exchange ideas? Did they end up being suspicious of each other? Did they actually manage to turn the level of mistrust in the group into something productive? What happened to the group if you mixed in some of the people who were theorists of that particular kind of problem? What happened to the group over a week or so of intense interaction in a small, in those days, perhaps isolated, perhaps peaceful environment. One of the things that came out of the Tavistock studies was that, oddly enough, the group itself began to develop a group culture. It wasn't that people who were rivals, adversaries, or enemies actually got to like each other, though sometimes they did. But they started to, if the group was intended to create some ideas, intended to break down stereotypes, intended to be at least diminishing mistrust. We won't actually talk about developing trust, but so often that happened as well. So whatever it wasn't traditional mediation. It wasn't somebody coming in from a local great power or hegemon and sort of listening for a while and then saying, well, I think this is the solution to your problem, because the idea was that the people themselves had to develop their own their own solution. So it wasn't the people who came in from outside, who were not part of the rival team, so to speak, were not mediators. They weren't arbitrators. They certainly weren't judges. And they formed a kind of a panel of facilitators. And the idea was to make it easier for the people who came from management or unions or Somalis or Kenyans, to actually put them in a situation which was, first of all, unofficial, secondly, informal, thirdly, was non-committing. And so it gave people who came an unusual opportunity to feel free to experiment with ideas in a sort of what-if manner, without actually officially committing themselves. So it was a very different kind of an atmosphere, a culture from traditional mediation, the kind of thing that Tricia and Yuri had discovered in Getting to Yes. It was still, of course, it was very much in people's minds. You know, it was very much a sort of theoretical thing. Wouldn't it be a good idea if we could pull together some people from, in those days it was the Israeli-Arab dispute, and get them to talk to each other and listen to each other and not actually talk at each other. And of course, it would have been a good idea. Still is, I think. But I think only John Burton was in a position to go to New York and talk to people he used to know from the UN and say, you know, we have this idea for this slightly new approach. Would we be helped? Would we allowed? Would we be welcomed if we tried this in a particular problem that you had at the moment, that where you were simply stuck, when the two sides, the three parties, the four sides were simply not speaking to each other, where you had actually a situation where the conflict had escalated, the conflict had taken deep root, the conflict had poisoned the relations between the two sides, or the three sides, or the four sides. And in other words, it had hit an impasse. They were at a deadlock. Could we help unlock the deadlock? Because John knew many people at the UN, I mean, he knew Thant, he knew Mike Pearson, the Canadian, he knew the Indian ambassador. The UN Secretary General said, we have this problem in your part of the world. You should know about, you know, the really nasty little conflict that's going on between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. Can you do something about it? Which presented my professor with a challenge, and he was never one to refuse a challenge. And so, much to everybody's surprise in the department, including mine, though I knew very little about it at the time. I was, like your students, I was about to take examinations, which tended to dominate one's thought. But we knew that something was going on. There were these sort of mysterious meetings in the law faculty where diplomats from different countries would suddenly appear and go upstairs, sit in a room, come out again, and a few of our teachers would emerge with triumphant smirks on their face and then say, sorry, we can't tell you anything what's going on, it's secret, go away. Anyway, in the end, to cut a long story short, they managed to pull together a group of people from the three warring countries, Actually, halfway through, it turned into two. Singapore, Malaysia on the one hand, and Indonesia on the other, and to start the process which ended up producing what today we would call a switch from track 2 activities to track 1 to official diplomats. So was it a fluke? Was it a method? Because one of the things I did subsequently was I went and interviewed all of the people who've been involved in this 20 years afterwards. And the thing that actually emerged from my interviews was that they didn't have the vaguest idea what the hell they were doing. They started out with the week thinking, well, we'll be able to inject some interesting theories and ideas into this, and it may turn out to be useful. But, you know, really, we don't know what's going to happen on day 1. And we certainly don't know what's going to happen on day 5. But we hope it will be productive, and we hope that people will start listening to each other. And indeed they did. As I say, they took up the ideas that had come from the first week and had a second week, and then carried on with the process. And it ended up, I think, in a formal peace agreement signed, I believe, in the Philippines. So a fluke, a process, a method. Well, the obvious thing to do was to try it again. And so once again, John Burton went to New York, to UN headquarters. And on this occasion, he went with this success under his belt. And so he had this fairly easy entry back into the UN. And this time the Secretary General said, well, I recently appointed a special mediator for Cyprus, and nobody will talk to him. The Greek Cypriots won't talk to him because he's promising that he will go and talk to the Turkish Cypriots, and the Turkish Cypriots are a load of rebels, and that means that the Greek Cypriots leaders, Archbishop Makarios, won't talk to my mediator. The Turkish Cypriots won't talk to him because he's already been to talk to Archbishop Makarios, and they think that will give him a biased view of what's going on, and so we're not talking to anybody. So nobody was talking to anybody in Cyprus at that time. Cyprus, incidentally, had only been, I think they had been independent something like 3 years. From 1960 onwards, the British had pulled out, apart from a couple of military bases, and independence had come to Cyprus. Nobody seemed to want it. The Greeks didn't want to have an independent Cyprus. They wanted to join with Greece. The Turks had said under no circumstances will that happen. There had been a furious violence in December 1963, so that by the time John Burton was talking about having a second try of this sort of strange hybrid thing, whatever it was, I think he called it controlled communication at the time, but it subsequently became known as problem-solving workshops. As I say, there was a green line through Nicosia. On the one side were the Turks, on the other side were the Greeks. There were a lot of Turkish villages in the northwest of the island surrounded by Greek National Guards. There were lots of Turkish villages, and there were lots of Greek villages around Famagusta that were surrounded by Turkish fighters. So the whole thing could explode again any minute. Anyway, so the UN Secretary General at the time said to John, all right, try to do something about Cyprus. If this unofficial, unconventional, creative, non-committing mixture of academics and participants. If it works, then see if it works in Cyprus. Okay, so the question was, of course, who were these theorists, these conflict resolution people who were going to be invited to come and talk to the Cypriots who wouldn't talk to each other formally, but might be able to talk to each other somewhere else? Italy, France, Malta. Turned out to be London. Who was going to be invited to come and sit on a panel of facilitators? And we're not too sure what the facilitators do. We're not quite sure whether anything good will come out of this, but let us try. And in the end, John invited 3 people. He invited a political scientist called Robert North from Stanford, who was at that time working on this whole issue of the escalation of relations between rivals to the point where they are on the verge of war. And indeed, in one of the cases he was looking at, of course, ended up in the First World War. There was a young doctor, no, I think he just got his doctorate, Chad Alger from Ohio State University, who was interested in how international organizations didn't work and how they might be encouraged to work, and how what the parts of international organizations like the UN that did work were usually the informal relationships that had been built up by the delegates there in spite of rules and regulations of how to conduct an organization. And the 4th person was a social psychologist. I think he was at Ann Arbor at the time, called Herbert Kelman. And Herb at the time had just produced this massive book called International Behavior. A lot of them were reprints of articles that had appeared in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, which had started up in the previous decade and was one of the first journals in our field. Students may be amazed to realize that in those days there were really only 2 journals which you had to read. One was the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and the other one was the Journal of Peace Studies out of Prio, out of Oslo. Compared with the 50 journals that you're expected to read these days, there, as I say, we had it easy. We had 2, and occasionally Gandhi Marg. Anyway, so Herb had just produced this huge book of readings, and was obviously somebody who was interested in the psychology of being in conflict. He was interested in things that had to do with mirror images or dehumanization, or the way in which our image of ourselves to a large degree determines the image that we have of enemies, and vice versa. So he was obviously somebody who was going to come and make a major contribution. But oddly enough, the thing that he contributed mostly to the week or 10 days meetings that took place were he'd also been working on this whole issue of how does one create national loyalty? And he'd come to the conclusion that, in fact, there were 2 ways of doing this. One was what he called sentimental attachment. In other words, you feel that the nation and the government represent you and is part of you, and you're part of it. And then there is the second way, which could, of course, reinforce the first way, but not necessarily, which he called instrumental loyalty, which means that you don't feel that you're completely part of the culture or the nation, but the government does things for you. It actually protects you, enables you to earn a living. It's your loyalty to it is because of what it does for you, not because of what that it represents you. And that was one of the things that actually came out very clearly during the week's conversation that we had. Well, I say we, I mean, I was a very junior member of that thing. I was sitting in a corner scribbling notes, not daring to raise my voice, confronted with all of these distinguished gentlemen. But Herb introduced this idea, and it seemed to make sense to the people who were around the table from the two communities. They'd come, of course, as they had been invited, and the idea was invite people not as representatives, not as officials. Invite them as individual members of a community that finds itself in this unfortunate position of being in conflict with the other side. So you came as individuals. You didn't come as reps. You didn't come as anybody who was official. And that, the idea, of course, is that it freed you up to speculate about what possible futures you could envisage, short term, long term, etc., etc. It freed you up to begin to think that you might be able to trust some of the people on the other side. Herb subsequently referred to this as developing a working trust. You know, you don't necessarily have to like the other people, though sometimes you do. You don't necessarily have to give them their complete and utter trust, but you do at least to have to get to the point where you trust them so that if they say they will do something, they will do it. And that they will be straight with you about what they really, really want. Not necessarily the public bargaining positions. One of the things, incidentally, that happened during the week was that, I mean, as many of these processes do, and this is one of the things I've learned over the years about problem solving, you have to give people an opportunity to let off steam at each other. Right? So that the first couple of days, you can probably spend 2 days while people on either side of the table make their case as to why they are in the situation they're in at the moment. And of course, they start off by saying, well, it's them. That's their fault if they hadn't done so and so, if they haven't ignored our rightful claim to, or if they hadn't ignored international law, or if they hadn't done these terrible things to us, at which point the other side will say, that's a load of rubbish. You know, don't forget what they did to us. Don't forget that in December 1963, many of our people were massacred by the Greek National Guard. But you know, after a while, they get tired of this. So do observers, believe me. And they begin to realize that they've come here to try and explore a future. And no matter how much they would love it if the others just disappeared, they're going to be there in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, and we have to learn to live with them. You know, peaceful coexistence if we can't get conflict resolution. One of the interesting things was, I recall, you know, I have a vivid memory of this because it was the first one I ever involved myself in. And I have a vivid memory of one of the delegations from the Turkish side talking about how he'd woken up one morning, gone for a walk in his garden and discovered a dead body at the end of the garden, which was one of his distant relatives. And also I have a vivid memory of the Greek delegation sort of confessing almost in a shamefaced way that really and truly speaking, they weren't any longer interested in enosis, which was the struggle that they had followed during the 50s to get rid of the British. Enosis meant union with Greece, and it scared the hell out of the Turks. So it was a major breakthrough when one of the Greek delegation, who was very close to Archbishop Macarius, said, look, yes, we have to actually continue to argue that we're interested in Enosis, but it will be a disaster for us if we actually achieved in Enosis. Incidentally, there had been in mainland Greece the year previously a very nasty military coup, and a particularly unpleasant military regime had taken over in Greece. So anybody on the island who was dumb enough to want to unify with Greece at that point really didn't know what was going on the mainland. So there were all sorts of surprises. That was how Herb got involved, first of all, in problem solving and workshops. And I think he went back to, I think he was at Harvard at this time. I think he'd moved from Ann Arbor, maybe Tamara knows. But he went back and started in Harvard to begin work on refining what was really a very sort of crude, not really well understood process of problem solving workshops. And he started to write a whole series of very carefully thought out analyses of what sort of difference does it make if you have a problem solving workshop series at different times during a conflict? What happens if you do it immediately after a diplomatic démarche has come to nothing? What happens if people are not talking to each other, but have been talking in the past and not got anywhere? What's the role of the facilitating panel? How big is the facilitating panel? Does there have to be a single chairman in a meeting? Most importantly, there has to be somebody on both sides, if there are two sides, or three or four, who is in a position to take back to their capital city, their decision makers, anything useful that comes out of the week or the 10 days. In other words, there has to be a channel back. Otherwise, there's no point in having the meeting. People go away. They've had this wonderful week. They found out that the enemy isn't quite as demonic as we thought, but keeping that information to themselves really doesn't do much good. You have to have a channel back. It's called, as Tamara will know, of course, the re-entry problem, because it's quite difficult. Herb started off, as we did, having set the Cyprus thing in motion, and I think we did have an impact on the island. Couple of years later, after a couple of hiccups, the president and vice president, Greek Cypriot, Turkish Cypriot, started to talk to one another about the future. Prior to that, a lot of the nasty little niggling things that happened on the islands gradually got relaxed. The Greeks started to feel safe enough to move into Turkish areas. Turks started to go back home into places that they'd abandoned. So tension eased on the island. I think we were to some degree responsible for that. So what next? And that was the question. We followed up, of course, on the island. We talked to the Archbishop, we talked to Faisal Kachuk, we talked to the people who were actually trying to run what turned out to be eventually a UN peacekeeping force on the island. Originally, there was a peacekeeping force there, but it was mainly British. And we thought that relations had improved, and we thought that eventually the islanders themselves, the two communities, would come up with a solution to how do you live together on an island, which is really very small, but which contains two suspicious and antagonistic communities, which just shows you how wrong you can be, because of course the island is still divided in a slightly different way. Anyway, oddly enough, Herb started to work back in Harvard with a colleague of his called Steve Cohen, and they originally started to work on the Kashmir problem. And I think one of his first workshops he actually held, and again, Tamara, you might remember this, involves Indian and Pakistani students over this whole issue about what to do with Kashmir, which was something that we were also interested in London. We actually managed to get to a point about 3 years later where the Indian government and the Pakistani government had actually given a green light to hold a series of workshops to see if we could come up with some kind of an acceptable solution. That actually fell apart. And I think it was at that point that all of the troubles in Northern Ireland started up. So if you were a conflict resolver, so-called, in London, and you were interested in trying to do something about a really very nasty conflict, all you had to do was hop on a plane or a boat for an hour, and you were in the middle of Belfast, where people were killing each other with great gusto. So for a while, that was something that interested us. Herb, in the meantime, of course, having tried to do something about the situation in Kashmir, and of course, the real world sort of intrudes even in the world of problem solving. I think he gave up on Kashmir because the Indians and Pakistanis had started a war in 1971, which really made things worse. But he then decided that what he would like to try his hand at, because of course he had always had this very strong interest in Israel, was to try to do something about relations between the communities living in Israel-Palestine. And for much of the rest of his career, that was his first, well, I'm not sure whether first love is the correct way of describing, but it was certainly the first thing that occurred to him where he could actually help to make something better. And he spent a great deal of time convening meetings between journalists on both sides of the divide, between politicians on both sides of the divide, usually out of office politicians, between former members of the IDF, and it was extremely arduous work, particularly in the early days, of course, because at the time I think there was a law in Israel that if anybody who was caught speaking to the PLO, ended up in jail. You were not supposed to talk to anybody from a terrorist organization. I wonder how familiar that sounds. And so Herb was breaking the law, really. He managed to do this by saying he was not talking to the PLO but he was talking to people who knew the PLO, so that he was able to distance himself. And he came very near finding solutions to it. What he would say about what's going on there at the moment, I don't know, but he was always a very hopeful, optimistic guy, and he would probably at the moment be working on trying to build some kind of a bridge between the adversaries who are still fighting and killing each other there. That was 10 minutes longer than I planned. I'm sorry, Oliver.
All good. That was really fascinating. Thank you very much.
I think Max did say something when he wrote to me last about, could I also introduce some information about where, sorry, where problem-solving workshops come from. So I tried to do that as well. Can we take a break, or do people have questions? Do you want to pin me to the wall some way? Tamara, what did I get wrong?
No, we need every minute we can listen to you, Christopher.
No, I really appreciated having this down, Chris. I mean, you tell it so well, and it's such a great story. And there's pieces in there that I didn't know about. I didn't know about the Kashmir conversations. I'm sure there's all sorts of other pieces there that were new, and it's important to have that history somewhere. And I think you're right that the whole design of the problem solving workshop and how it came about has fallen into a bit of a single narrative, and so having that be nuanced a bit is really helpful. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the first half, and I look forward to the second half where you're going to talk about your work in Colombia.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I didn't take part in the very first one, but I talked to almost all of the people who'd been on that particular facilitation panel. And the thing that struck me about it was that none of them knew what the hell they were doing. You know, there's an English expression, flying by the seat of your pants, you know, which basically means you're making it up as you go along. And almost everybody who was involved in that first thing sort of said, you know, well, we turned up on the first morning and we didn't know what was going to happen. And I think that was something which actually helped to convince the participants from Indonesia and Malaysia that this wasn't a deep laid plot. You know, that these people were not part of MI5 or MI6 or something like that, or that they'd come in with an agenda. You know, they'd come in with a sort of, well, I have 3 solutions to that particular problem, because they clearly didn't know what they were doing. And in an odd kind of a way, I think that helped them. It certainly, I mean, I remember talking to one of the facilitators. I don't know whether you ever recall Tony DeRook, and he'd arranged the conference in the headquarters of the SIBA Foundation, which was one of these, you know, very do-gooding organizations based in I think it was in Amsterdam, and they had this wonderful setup in their headquarters in London, which had, you know, all of the modern technology in 1965. You know, it had microphones and on the table and recording apparatus and one thing other. And Tony said it was very interesting because every half hour or so, one of the Indonesians or one of the Singaporeans or one of the Malaysians will sort of get up and drift out and walk around to the recording part of the complex, just to make sure that the recording techniques were all switched off and they weren't quietly being recorded for subsequent confrontation. Last month in London you said so and so. The great thing was they didn't take any recordings or records of that, so you couldn't be held responsible for, on this such and such a day you admitted that, which is also, I think, one of the big advantages of the workshop. Keep it confidential, keep it private.
Tamra, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, actually, I do have a question at this point before we transition to the second half. And Chris, you just said that John Burton, again, former ambassador, and others doing those first workshops were flying by the seat of their pants. But John had been a diplomat, and my understanding was fairly frustrated by the conduct of diplomacy and what he may have been constrained in what he could do when he was an official diplomat, that then now having this alternative venue and kind of the blessing at some level of the UN to go ahead and try whatever you can, I guess I wonder how that might have been freeing for him, and in a sense, if you could comment a little bit on the state of diplomacy, both then and even now, and the kinds of restrictions that it has for moving parties forward, and how this opportunity and again how it evolved represented a response to that, and in the true tradition of kind of participatory action research, how you try something and you figure out how it works and you tinker with it and you do it again, and then you try it again and then you tinker with it and you get feedback and that type of thing. He had this chance, as did you and the others who really pioneered this, to respond to those problems of traditional diplomacy. So I wonder if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on what you all were responding to.
I think what he was responding to in the cases that were the first that he took up was a sense of frustration and a sense of failure. If you go back and read the origins of the conflict over, well, basically it was over Borneo and Sarawak and areas that had been part of the British Empire, and were then being absorbed into Malaysia, or that was the whole issue: territory and whose was it? And of course, the Indonesians said, "Look, this before you lot came, before the British came, and had this exploitative relationship over these areas. The people who live there were exactly the same as the people who lived in Java and Sumatra, and therefore they're Indonesians." And I think a whole series of who had tried to come in and get them to talk to each other, sort of sensibly. In fact, I think Robert Kennedy at one point came in from the United States and tried to produce a track one process, you know. But and this actually only struck me subsequently. Of course, you know, if the UN comes in at that particular point of time, the UN probably represents to a third world country the Security Council. You know, it's a great power organization, and they see it as operating on behalf of the great powers. And I think that's one thing that, you know, if you're a small country in Africa, or if you're a country in Latin America, you know, they have the same attitude towards the OAS. I mean, the OAS is Organization of American States, is dominated by, because it's paid for by, the United States of America. Okay, so they're always on this sort of lookout for what, you know, what's the angle of these guys? What are they coming in for? What do they want with us? And I think John was taking advantage, and you know, I really think he had a great advantage, though he didn't actually recognize at the time, that first of all, he was Australian, right? If you're an Australian and you're trying to do some work in Northern Ireland, nobody knows what the hell you're up to, but presumably you are not actually working on behalf of Her Majesty's government. You're not actually working on behalf of the UN. You're not working on behalf of, you know, the United States of America. You're an anomaly, and that turned out to be a hell of an advantage. I mean, I once had this sort of daft idea that maybe I should actually take out Irish citizenship, which would actually make me less threatening to parts of the world that had been part of the British Empire. You know, as I say, it was a daft idea, and you know, if you know anything about the weather in Ireland, it was definitely a no-no. But I think he had, and I think Herb had, though Herb had it in a slightly different way. Herb was one of these Israelis. Well, he wasn't an Israeli actually. He was a New Jersey Jew, but you know, he knew very many of the Palestinian leadership, so he didn't sort of fit into their stereotypes. And I think the same is true with many of these people. And it's something that I think we in the peace and conflict game have to overcome by understanding how we look to people that we're trying to help. You know, I think one of the things that I used to ask my students, you remember the series of trainings that we actually organized down at Point of View, and you know, we put them through, if you recall, a number of exercises as we took them. And the first exercise that I ever asked them to do was to sit down and, if you are thinking of, you know, intervening in an ongoing conflict, for example in Sudan, right? How do you think you are going to look to the Sudanese with whom you are interacting? Because if you don't actually think about that, you are going to be very badly surprised, and sadly surprised as well, in many ways. You know, one of the things that Herb sort of specialized in over the years was, you know, this whole idea of perceptions and stereotypes and one thing or another. And one of the sets of ideas that we took into problem solving with us in the 1960s and 70s was it's very easy to understand how people who are in a relationship as enemies, how they misperceive each other. Right? But it's even more difficult, I think, for members of a facilitating panel or mediators in general to actually understand how they appear to the people who are involved in the conflict. It's all very well to talk about, as we do frequently and write about, being neutral and balanced and not committed to one side or the other. Well, okay, that's perfectly true, but how do we appear to them, and what do we appear to be committed to, irrespective of whether we're committed to one side or other of them? I mean, we bring in we bring in values, we bring in we bring in perceptions of us which may vitiate our ability to operate as honest brokers, whatever the hell that means, because people do see us as being as coming from a certain place, coming from a certain background, coming from a certain set of attitudes, some of which may be antithetical to what they would like to have in a facilitator. And I'm thinking now of, I don't know, do you remember one of our master students, Beatrice Bejarano? Anyway, whether you do or not, she was a very nice Colombian lady who came and did a master's degree with us. And on one occasion, I remember she went to a conference, I think somewhere down in Ecuador, which included a large number of people from Colombia. And not only from Colombia, but also from people close to the the rebels or the insurgents or the drug dealers or whatever you want to call them. And she got accused of being a CIA agent, which she wasn't. At least if she was a very clever one. And the reason for her being accused of that was because she went to George Mason University in Virginia. And Virginia, of course, was right next to the headquarters of the CIA. So it was perfectly reasonable for somebody who is highly suspicious of Americans to think that that connection is clearly that she is a CIA operative. Right? And it took her about 2 or 3 days to sort of get it clear, and the only way in which she did manage to get herself cleared that whatever else she wasn't a CIA operative, was that she was vouched for by John Paul Lederach. Right? Start again with Herb. And one of the things that I was always impressed with his work was that he never took anything for granted. He always tried to check out things, try to answer questions which applied to the use of this technique, like okay, who gets to come? Who are you trying to get from the Greek Cypriots or the Turkish Cypriots to come to London? What sort of a person do you want? Where do they come? In other words, if you want to actually pull them to a quiet place where you're not going to be interfered with, by outside influences so that they can concentrate on the topic at hand and one another. How can you arrange this? And this, incidentally, gets increasingly difficult as technology catches up with you. You know, we never had to bother with, for example, people sitting in any of these meetings, looking at their telephones and texting. You could isolate them and they could focus. Timing, when is it likely to operate most effectively? And this is the subject that my chapter is about in the book, because when we started, the idea was you could run a problem-solving series or a single workshop when people were stuck, when they were deadlocked, when they weren't talking to each other. You could restore communication. And the other assumption that we made was that you didn't want officials, but you could actually have the biggest impact by getting people around the table who were not officials themselves, but were close to officials. And I remember again one of the series that I was involved with Herb and Hal Saunders. We had a whole series of former IDF members. I think we had on one occasion we had the general who was in charge of security on the West Bank, but he wasn't any longer the official in charge. So get close. Now, the great thing about Herb, of course, was that he wasn't actually content with this idea that, okay, you do this when people are simply not talking to each other. He expanded the whole range of people who came. You had journalists on one occasion, you had school teachers on another, you had people who were former members of the IDF on another. So he expanded the range, and therefore the impact, the focus of the impact. So okay, you could get local community leaders on one occasion. It depended on what you were trying to influence. So when I started to write this chapter, after Tamra had sent me several emails threatening never to feed me again if I didn't produce a chapter for her, I thought what we had been doing in another project at what we now call the Carter School, what used to be the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. We spent an awful lot of time looking at cases of civil war in places like the Philippines and in Colombia. And one of the foci, whatever it is, of what we were trying to do was to ask questions about local peace communities, communities that had tried to opt out of the ongoing struggle in Colombia. It was, for those of you who know anything about Colombia, an extremely complicated and quite appallingly violent situation. I mean, there were, at one point, there was something like 6 major rebel organizations fighting the government in Colombia. There were paramilitary organizations that were linked up to the drug trade, who were also fighting for territory, people, and the drug trade. So that in a sense, if you were part of a community that was living in a remote part of Colombia, and you were sick to death of what was going on around you, was there any way that you could declare your neutrality in that struggle and say to the various armed combatants, look, we don't want anything more to do with your violence. We are going to declare ourselves a non-violent community or a non-violent zone. We're going to declare ourselves a disarmed zone into which you are not going to be able to bring your weapons. Okay, you can come in, you can have a beer, but you're not going to bring weapons in. You are going to stop kidnapping our young men to join your organization. We are going to try to arrange a truce between you and the other organizations that are fighting for territory around you, because we don't want any further violence. And what we can do is we can offer you a safe zone, right, where you will be safe as well as us. We got involved in this in around about 2000. There was an organization in Colombia called 100 Municipalities of Peace. And what they were trying to do was something which, at least at the international, interstate level, there are sort of rules and norms about being neutral. Right? There aren't any domestically. So, of course, what happened often in many of the cases of these peace zones, they simply became targets for everybody. They became targets for the paramilitaries who were struggling to control the drug trade. They became targets for the armed forces, the police, the Colombian army. They became targets for the guerrillas, for the FARC, for the ELN, etc., etc. But in some cases, they managed to bring it off. They managed to actually create a zone of peace. They managed to create a zone of peace for a long time. And so one of the things that we were interested in from about 2000 onwards was how the survivability of these peace zones. How did they manage to do it? How did they manage to negotiate with the combatants? How did they manage to maintain the peace? And not just maintain the peace, of course, because once they actually secured external security, how did they organize themselves with it? Because a lot of them said we're not just zones of peace, we're zones of peace and democracy and development. So how do you do that in the middle of a civil war? They tried to do this, probably, I think they started back in the 1990s, 1998, 1999, and all the way through, while the struggle was going on, they were trying to maintain this sort of local peace. When they first started, they had an administration in Bogota, which was interested in negotiating peace with the paramilitaries and with the guerrillas. Then that was replaced by a president and an administration who said, we are not going to make peace with these criminals, we are not going to make peace with these terrorists, we're going to wipe them off the face of the earth. Right? That was 2002. He lasted for 2 terms, illegally, incidentally, giving himself a second term in 2006. He was then succeeded by his Minister of Defense, who turned out to be completely different and turned the whole government policy from one of eradicate the guerrillas, eradicate these communists, to we have to negotiate with these people. Okay. President Santos, who actually ended up, I think, getting a Nobel Peace Prize, actually didn't negotiate with the with one of the guerrilla organizations, the FARC, made peace, and 2016 there was this breakthrough, and the government actually concluded a peace treaty with the FARC. And it struck us at the end of that 16-year period when we had been monitoring these organizations and these communities, that what we were seeing before our very eyes was this whole process of reconciliation after peace had been declared. And so we actually, by this time, had built up a network of connections with very many local communities in Colombia. So we started to ask ourselves the question of, okay, you're a peace community and you've tried to create peace locally. How do you cope with national level peace? In other words, what are the problems that peace brings to you? And there were some sort of fairly obvious ones, which were involved in what do you do when you have a whole series of former guerrillas demobilized next to you and reinserted in your community, when what you're doing in some cases is you're reinserting people who 3 or 4 years ago came through this community and burnt it to the ground. You know, how do you reconcile between local community members, peasants, campesinos, and former guerrillas? You know, if you're interested in reconciliation, there's a problem for you. How do they cope? How do they cope with peace? So we produced a book called Confronting Peace. There you go. It's a whole series of chapters on what various peace communities have had to contend with once national peace has been declared at a national level. Okay. How do you rebuild? What do you do in situations where some of the people living in your community have been driven out and pushed across the border into Panama, or into Ecuador? What do you do when they come back and you find that other people have already moved into their land, their houses, if they're still there? How do you sort out actually who owns that property? What do you do when somebody comes back who was a notorious member of the paramilitaries and is responsible for people being your friends, your relatives being killed back in 2009? What do you do when promised resources from the government in order to help you rebuild haven't come because somehow they have evaporated en route between the capital and your village? What do you do about the fact that your school got burnt down 6 or 7 years ago and there's never been a school teacher? And how do you actually deal with the Ministry of Education and ask if they will reset up your school or your clinic? Or what do you do about people who have disappeared? What do you do if somebody says, I know where your disappeared nephew or son is? He's buried out on that hillside with another 20 bodies. So there are problems of confronting peace. Now, the other thing about this is I haven't told you the full story, which is that the great peace agreement of December 2016 only dealt with one of the guerrilla organizations. There were something like, by the time we get to 2016, about 4 of the guerrilla organizations that were existing, say, in 1989, 1990, have come in from the cold. They've handed their weapons in, they've surrendered to the government. But there are still 2 of them that you have not been negotiating with, and they're carrying on the struggle. The peace, it was called the Treaty of Havana because it was actually concluded in Havana. The peace only partly covers the combatants. All right. The paramilitaries have actually handed in their weapons and become, in quotes, respectable civilian citizens in 2006. Okay. The Fuerzas Armadas, Revolutionary Forces of FARC. Sorry about that. All right, they have actually made the agreement in 2016. The ELN, the other major guerrilla organization, hasn't. It's continuing to fight. Furthermore, it's actually trying to move into areas that were actually occupied by the FARC before, because often they turn out to be very useful areas for movement and for money. Right? You try to take over the drug organization. What do you do about the, how do you cope with the fact that the local commanders of the AUC, the paramilitaries, have decided that becoming a civilian isn't worth it, and it's probably better and much more, much more lucrative in order to go back to running drugs, and therefore they want you to go back to growing drugs, even though the government doesn't want you to go back to growing drugs because they're under pressure from the United States. There are all of these problems. And it struck me that one way I could get out of satisfying Tamra was to write about these problems and the possibility that you could use problem-solving workshops at all levels to try to do something about these local conflicts, which still are going to be there, even when peace has been declared. Conflicts that exist between former combatants and former local people. Conflicts which occur over title to land. Conflicts that occur over development funds. What are they going to do with development funds? We need a road, we need a clinic, right? We need a way of getting to market. All of these are competing. So I decided to sort of speculate a bit. And that's what this my chapter in here is about. Could you use problem-solving approaches, however you define them, to deal with some of these post-agreement problems? Notice that what I'm saying is post-agreement. I'm not saying post-war, because the war goes on in some circumstances. I'm not saying even post-conflict, because the conflict is still there frequently. Even though peace has broken out, the peace agreement has got lots and lots of problems with it. So you actually do need to think about how you are going to structure methods for dealing with these problems. I wish I'd actually read this before I wrote the thing for camera, but there seems to me to be a lot of literature about what I've subsequently learned is called infrastructures for peace. In other words, can you, as part of the peace agreement, set up some some organization, local, regional, national, which has as its major task the sorting out of conflicts that arise after the peace has been signed. There's a literature on this which I commend to your attention. I mean, one of the more interesting examples is if you look at what happened in South Africa in the period, roughly speaking, from 1992 to 1994, 95, because what happened during that period was that the South African government, the nationalists and the ANC agreed to set up a national organization with regional offices, and the regional offices had local offices whose job was to deal with local community conflicts which arose while they were negotiating the final agreement. So they had a whole sort of three-tier system of peace committees, peace committees in a community, in a region, and nationally in Johannesburg. It's a very, very interesting experiment, I find, and I just kept wondering, how did they cope with conflicts which continued to erupt between the ANC and then Carter, for example, or between ANC and the national government? Would it have helped if they'd had a couple of weeks training in the use of problem-solving approaches? Probably not. A couple of weeks. You probably need much more than that. But anyway, so I think this, if you want to read this, it's an exercise in speculation. Where else can problem-solving workshops help? And if you come across anybody who's using them, or if you get involved in using them yourselves, do please let me know what success you have. And also, incidentally, let me know what failures you have, because I firmly believe that you learn a lot more from failure than you learn from success. And I say that because I've experienced lots of failures over the last 50 odd years. So thank you. I'm now retiring to drink.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Chris. That was truly fascinating. Both of your parts, the first one on how it all started in Cyprus, and then your work on Colombia. For the sake of timing and like giving the others the opportunity to ask questions, I'll be very, very brief as a discussant. Just two quick comments on the first part. I found it like really interesting, kind of when you read about it now, kind of the whole problem-solving approaches, it's pretty much like carved in stone, kind of, and Kelman did this and kind of you should do it like the same. So it was really nice how it evolved, kind of from the Tavistock work with groups, and then kind of Burton taking it up, shaping it a bit further, Kelman taking it up, shaping it a bit further, applying it to a different context, and so on. So that's really encouraging in a way. And your work in Colombia, what struck me, it's really counterintuitive. Like before the peace agreement, you looked at islands of peace, and worked with them in a dialogical way. And then after the peace agreement, you looked at kind of the conflicts that peace brought, kind of looking at islands of conflicts and applying problem-solving dialogue work there. So super interesting. I have lots of questions, but I would like to open it up for the audience. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Oliver.
Shall we add the questions or?
Yes, please go ahead.
Correct.
Ask questions. Now's
Yes.
the time.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris, for this really very intriguing account, especially your personal account and the history of problem solving. But what I wanted to ask you, what struck me was this this concept of local peace community Colombia. I think I already heard it once, but this time I thought isn't or it's actually two questions. So the first question is more a conceptual question. What is being done by creating a local peace community that detaches itself from a larger context of war? Isn't this actually non-resolution through non-resolution, or peace through? So is it actually problem solving, while it is might also be the opposite? And the second question is, do you know maybe of other examples of this kind of procedure with these kind of local communities? Obviously, Northern Iraq Kurdistan might eventually be such an example with a nationalist foundation, of course, but are you aware of other examples?
Okay. Yeah, on your first question, yeah, you know, there's a very interesting doctoral dissertation by a colleague of mine on the whole issue of declaring yourself neutral in a domestic conflict. Can you do this? How do you do it? What he discovered, of course, was that first of all, it's incredibly difficult to do it, and second of all, that of course the combatants, really regard this as a form of treachery, particularly if you're talking about the government. I mean, we had another collection which we published about 10 years ago about the relationship between national peacemaking and local peacemaking, and it became perfectly obvious that the government in Bogota absolutely loathed local peace communities because, of course, they were opting out of a righteous struggle against all of these communist rebels, and second of all, they had no right to do this. I mean, they were citizens of Colombia. There was an elected Colombian government. I mean, it was and still is, God bless it, a democracy. So what right had you to opt out of this struggle? And of course, you were incredibly you angered the local combatants who were struggling to overthrow the government because you were opting out of a righteous struggle to get rid of a tyrannical government. So you got flack from both sides. I think I think it was more difficult for people negotiating with government forces because the argument that they put forward was pretty unanswerable. By what rights can you opt out of this? You're supposed to be with us, we're the government. With the guerrillas, it was sometimes easier to do because, in fact, when you're dealing with national government forces, they come from outside. They come from far away. They're recruits. They're people who are, recruited into the national army. They don't give a damn about your community because they come from, a long, long way away. Guerrillas tend to be recruited locally. So you can negotiate with the local guerrilla commandante because he's not just the local guerrilla commandante. He's your aunt's second cousin. So you can you have a relationship with him. It's not just combatant to campesino. But you're right. It's it's incredibly difficult to do that. You are trying to create another unlawful, unsupported kind of condition. This, in answer to your second question, I mean, this actually all started in the Philippines. This idea of peace communities, peace zones. So there are lots of examples of communities in places like Luzon, where the local indigenous communities who have a unifying culture that enables them to sort of say, we're not interested in the struggle that you're actually taking part in against the government in Manila. We're not part of that. We're not part of your culture. That makes it rather easier for them to sort of say with some conviction, we are withdrawing from this. We will be neutral. We will try to keep the peace here. But really and truly speaking, we're nothing to do with you. It's much, much more difficult in places on Mindanao, where there are tremendous conflicts which go on, not merely with the People's Liberation Army, not really with the MILF, but there's Mindanao is a conflict ground between settlers from the north and local indigenous people. And the problem is that the people from the north tend to be Christians, and the people who are indigenous and have been in Mindanao for years and years and years and generations, they're natural adversaries. So the whole thing is a total mess. But there are still some communities in many parts of Mindanao and the islands moving towards Malaya, where local communities have said enough. We're not even going to allow people to carry through the sort of traditional practice of revenge. We'll keep it calm. We'll keep it peaceful. So yes. Also, there are some things which I wish I knew some more about, but there are a couple of chapters in here in Africa, in the Sudan, and in Kenya, up in the northeast of Kenya, where people have actually declared large areas of Ethiopia as being peace zones. Keep the military out. And the military, as long as the guerrillas don't go in, are very happy to stay out. It means they have less to police. So yes, there are lots and lots of other examples which I wish I knew more about, and I wish I had another book to show you, but which I'm sure you don't wish. Anything else from anybody else who are now keeping quiet?
Raising her hand. We also have a question in the chat online, wanting one or two more examples beyond South Africa of organizations that work in post-peace agreement conflicts that you mentioned. If you could give maybe a little bit more detail about that, if you're aware of any more organizations and contexts and how they work. And then Tamra.
Okay, have a look at northern Ghana. There are some examples there of communities that have opted out of a struggle which went on there for quite a long time. Another example, which again is quite interesting, is Kenya. Kenyan started local communities as peace zones up in the northeast of the country in what used to be the old NFD, a place called Wajir, and it was actually started by women who got extremely tired of the fact that they couldn't use a market in Wajir, because it instead of being a place where you went and you bought food and got drink, etc., it was a place where the men quarreled. You know, it was rather like the first act of Romeo and Juliet. And so the market women in Wajir said, you know, enough. They got together. They declared a peace zone around the market, and then gradually it became the peace zone around Wajir. And then the local district commissioner, a government official, sort of found, somewhat to his astonishment, that, you know, people would go into this town, into this market, and they would be perfectly happy to keep the peace. So gradually, the idea spread, and the Kenyan government eventually, and this was an experiment which I'm not sure quite worked, said, all right, we're going to have local peace zones in Kenya throughout the country. And this will be a means of making sure that the next time there is an election in Kenya, whatever happens, the whole place doesn't collapse in fratricidal strife, which elections in Kenya tended to do. You know, I have, if I have another 20 years of life, I'm going to actually write a book called, you know, Elections as conflict creating processes. No, I can't do that. I don't have 20 years. You're going to have, one of you is going to have to write that. But it was an interesting example of a very local initiative started by women who are fed up with, you know, men behaving badly, and it gradually sort of spread to the regions, throughout the region, and then up to the national level. There are some examples. I'll give you one other quick example. The border area between South Sudan and North Sudan. It's an international boundary that cuts across a large number of nomad areas that nomads drive cattle south across the border during the dry season, and they drive them back, I think, during the wet season. And of course, you know, driving cattle, if you've seen any Western films, always creates absolute havoc in any settled communities. And so what they have been doing is producing what they call the zones of peace. Is maybe a miss, but they're corridors of peace, which are reserved for nomads driving cattle north or south, and they don't interfere with settled farmers who otherwise would lose all their crops. And so this is a particular specialized kind of a zone of peace, but it's not just in between North and South Sudan. There are lots of other places where the locals can actually arrange this. It's locally arranged, locally, you know. Sometimes I think, you know, leave it to the locals. They're not stupid.
Which I think nicely sums up our lecture series, you know, because we focus on local perspectives.
Good.
For the sake of time, Chris, thank you very, very much. That was a great and rich session. Thanks a lot. Um,